Welcome back to the Deep Dive, the place where we sift through the sources, extract the golden insights, and get you up to speed on concepts that shape our universe.
And more importantly, shape our understanding of it.
That's it, exactly. And today, our stack of sources is dealing with a concept that, well, it sits right at the intersection of science, philosophy, and just everyday observation. We're talking about emergence.
It's arguably one of the most intellectually compelling ideas out there, but it can also be, a bit frustrating when you're trying to connect the dots between the very, very small and the very large.
That's our mission today, to dive deep into emergence. At its core, it's the idea that when parts interact in a wider whole, entirely new, complex properties or behaviors arise.
And these are properties that the parts just didn't possess on their own.
Right. We're not just looking at things that are complicated. We are hunting for that dividing line between systems that are merely complex and systems that are genuinely new.
And the framework for this is ancient, really. Aristotle put it beautifully. The totality is not, as it were, a mere heap, but the whole is something besides the parts. Emergence is just central to any theory of complex systems.
And what I love is how visual and just how everywhere this phenomenon is. Our sources give such powerful examples to ground the whole thing.
They really do.
I mean, if you just need a quick hook, think about the intricate six-fold fractal patterns you see in a single snowflake.
That's a perfect one. A single water molecule, H0, is a simple structure. But when millions of them interact under specific conditions, the right temperature and pressure.
You get this incredible self-similar complexity.
Exactly. That pattern isn't encoded in a single molecule. It emerges from their collective dance.
And it's the same principle in biology, just scaled way up. Take a termite. A single termite has, what, a few basic hardwired rules?
It's very simple rules. It moves, it finds food, it reacts to pheromones. That's about it.
Yeah. But when you get a whole colony together, this huge decentralized network of simple little bugs, you get these complex cathedral mounds.
These things regulate temperature, humidity, airflow. It's a sophisticated collective intelligence. But the blueprint for that cathedral is nowhere to be found in any single termite.
It's purely an emergent property of the group. And our sources say the ultimate example is life itself.
Right. Life, consciousness, self-replication, these are all seen as emergent properties of basic chemistry and physics.
You have hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, just atoms following standard laws.
But arrange them in a complex enough way, and suddenly you have a system that replicates, evolves, and eventually wonders about its own existence.
And it's just mind-blowing.
Philosophically, this focus on the origin of new properties is called emergentism. A thinker named Nikolai Hartmann even came up with a special term for them.
What was that?
He called them a categorial novum.
A new category.
A new category, exactly. It's not just an improvement on the lower level, it's a completely different kind of thing. The higher system depends on the lower parts, of course, but it operates with its own autonomous nature.
That really deepens the definition. We're talking about a change in what actually exists. And that brings us to the critical distinction we have to nail down because it's the fork in the road for this whole discussion.
It really is. This goes back to G.H. Lewis in 1875 when he coined the term emergent.
So he contrasted the emergent with the merely resultant. Let's start there. What's a resultant property?
Something that's resultant is just a simple sum or difference of its parts. The key here is that the components are homogeneous and commensurable.
Meaning you can measure them on the same scale.
Exactly. Think of two forces pushing a block. You have force A at 5 newtons, force B at 3 newtons. The result is 8 newtons of motion. It's traceable, predictable.
You can just do the math.
You can do the math. So if I mix 2 cups of blue paint and 2 cups of yellow, I get 4 cups of green. Predictable? That's resultant.
Okay, so what makes something emergent?
Well, this is the opposite. Lewis said emergence involved the cooperation of things of unlike kinds. The combination creates a property that is unlike its components because they are incommensurable.
Incommensurable. So they can't be measured or compared on the same scale.
Precisely. Take hydrogen and oxygen. You mix them, you get water. Now, try to find the property of wetness by measuring the properties of hydrogen gas and oxygen gas separately.
You can't.
You can't. Wetness is an emergent quality that operates on a totally different macro scale. It's incommensurable with the properties of its component gases. The whole introduces a genuinely new category of reality.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly for the big debate, the difference between a really big calculation and something that genuinely introduces new rules. So let's unpack this core philosophical debate because that line is exactly what separates science from what critics might call, well, magic.
That's the perfect pivot, because the entire field is structured around this line. Philosophers like David Chalmers and Mark Bedell stress that you absolutely have to distinguish between weak emergence and strong emergence.
Why is that so important?
Chalmers says if you don't, it just causes enormous confusion, because they are, in his words, quite different concepts.
So let's start on the safer ground. Weak emergence. This is the one that's generally accepted in science, right?
Yes, complexity science, thermodynamics, physics, they all work with this. It describes new properties that arise from the fundamental interactions, but, this is the key, the property is still amenable to computer simulation.
So you can, in theory, model it.
You can model it. It might be what we call computationally irreducible, meaning even if you know all the rules for every component, you can't just write a simple equation to predict the outcome. The only way to know what happens is to run the full simulation step by step.
Like a traffic jam. I can't just write one formula for a traffic jam. I have to model thousands of individual cars making individual decisions over time to see where the jam forms.
Precisely. That's why traffic jams, or a flock of starlings, a murmuration, are classic examples. The system properties, like the swirling of the flock, are new. You don't see that in a single bird.
But the underlying rules are simple. Cohesion, separation, alignment. Just simple rules for how each bird reacts to its neighbors.
And Mark Bedell added that these properties are scale-dependent. You only see them if the system's big enough. The behavior might seem chaotic at the macro scale, but it's generated by microscopic parts that are fully deterministic.
So weak emergence is fascinating, but it's not metaphysically mysterious. If you had an infinitely powerful computer, you could trace every interaction back to the fundamental laws.
Exactly. It's a computational problem, not a metaphysical one. Which is why Bedell notes that if consciousness were just weakly emergent, it wouldn't really solve the classic philosophical questions. It would just mean the brain is a really, really complicated computer.
Okay, that leads us into the deep end. Strong emergence. This is where the friction is.
This is where the real debate lies. Strong emergence describes qualities that are utterly irreducible to the system's parts. The whole is truly, ontologically, other than the sum of its parts.
So if that's true, it means that new fundamental laws or new causal powers literally appear once a system hits a certain level of complexity.
And the consequence of that is profound. If a property is genuinely irreducible, then by definition, no simulation of the system can exist.
Why not?
Because if you could simulate it, that simulation would be a reduction of the system to its components. It would immediately collapse it back into weak emergence. Strong emergence says there's a genuine novelty barrier you can't cross with a computer.
Now, this is where I have to push back a bit. If you're saying this new property can't be reduced, can't be simulated, doesn't that make it scientifically untestable? Where does this new thing come from ex nihilo out of nothing?
And that is the core challenge. As our sources state, strong emergence is rare, if not entirely absent, in well-established physics. Bedell famously said that while it's logically possible, it's uncomfortably like magic.
The dreaded magic critique.
Yes, because it suggests you're illegitimately getting something from nothing. It seems to violate a fundamental principle. Ex nihilo nihil fit nothing comes from nothing. If the parts don't contain the potential for this new power, where does it come from?
It sounds like a philosophical dead end. But then we get to the idea of causal overdetermination from the philosopher Jaegwon Kim. This seems like a direct logical attack on the idea.
It's the primary hurdle for strong emergentists. Kim's argument is all about downward causation.
So the idea that the emergent property at the high level can cause an effect at a lower level.
Exactly. So let's walk through it. Say you have an emergent property, M, like our wetness example, and M depends entirely on a physical base state. P, the arrangement of water molecules.
Okay, so M is the emergent property, P is the physical base.
Now let's say the wetness, M, causes a paper towel to absorb water. That's a new state, M star. But that absorption also have to have a physical basis, P star, right? The actual capillary action in the paper fibers.
Okay, so M causes M star, and P causes P star.
But here's the problem. We already know from physics and chemistry that the physical state P, the water molecules, is sufficient on its own to cause P star, the absorption.
The laws of physics say P causes P star.
Right. So now we have two causes for P star. We have the physical base P and we have the emergent property M.
It's being caused twice.
It's being caused twice. That's the overdetermination problem. If the physical base P is already doing all the work, then what is M for? It's redundant.
And Kim argues that's highly implausible.
It's more than implausible. It's a killing blow to their idea. The whole point of strong emergence is that the new property should make distinctive and novel causal contributions. But if the underlying physics is already doing everything, then M is causally irrelevant. It's just a label we put on a complex physical state.
So this argument really foices us back into the domain of weak emergence, where everything is, in principle, reducible.
It definitely explains why strong emergence is treated with such skepticism. It seems to require a violation of what's called causal closure, the idea that every physical effect has a sufficient physical cause.
But even if that's the philosophical limit, the sheer practical limits of reductionism in science are still profound. I mean, scientists can't actually sit down and calculate everything from first principles.
Not even close. And that takes us right into how the hard sciences, especially physics, actually deal with this challenge of scale and complexity.
Right. So in physics, we're mostly dealing with what philosophers call weak emergence.
We are, but physics frames it in terms of necessary descriptions. We're talking about properties or laws that only occur at macroscopic scales, vast scales in space or time, but not at microscopic ones.
Nobel laureate Robert Laughlin had a lot to say about this. He said, for any system with many particles, you just can't calculate everything exactly from the microscopic equations. It's too complex.
And even more importantly, he highlighted the role of broken symmetry. The fundamental equations for the microscopic particles might be perfectly symmetrical, but after a phase transition like a liquid freezing into a solid, that symmetry is gone at the macro level.
So the laws governing the microstate don't look like the laws governing the macrostate. If I look at a block of ice, the underlying HO molecule equations are symmetrical, but the actual crystal lattice of the ice is not.
Precisely. And so, Laughlin argues, macroscopic systems have to be described in their own unique terminology. They have properties that don't depend on many of the tiny microscopic details.
Yeah.
You use fluid dynamics to calculate airflow over a wing. You don't track every single air molecule.
This sounds exactly like the argument from Philip W. Anderson's famous 1972 essay, More is Different. That was a landmark piece of writing.
It really was. Anderson directly attacked what he called the constructionist hypothesis, that reductionist dream, that you could start from fundamental laws and just build the entire universe up layer by layer.
And he said that idea just breaks down when confronted with the twin difficulties of scale and complexity.
Yes. And that led to his powerful defining quote, "At each level of complexity, entirely new properties appear. Psychology is not applied biology, nor is biology applied chemistry."
He essentially gave scientists permission to study their own fields as fundamentally independent, even if we know everything is ultimately based on physics.
It forced scientists to be emergentists in practice, even if they're reductionists in theory. And it turns out the complexity doesn't just make calculation hard. Sometimes it might make it impossible.
This is that finding about the non-computable universe from Gu and his colleagues. Non-computable, how can a physical system be literally impossible to calculate?
Well, they showed that for certain infinite physical systems, if you could systematically calculate their macroscopic properties from the microscopic description alone, you'd also be able to solve known undecidable problems in computer science, like the halting problem.
Wait, so the universe's complexity is linked to the fundamental limits of logic itself?
It seems so. It creates a kind of protective shell around the macroscopic world. It implies that a theory of everything that describes all the fundamental particles is necessary, but it might not be sufficient for a complete understanding of the universe.
So those macroscopic laws, like thermodynamics, might still require conjectures suggested by experiments, simulations, or insight. We have to look up the hierarchy, not just down.
Which is why this is such a vital area of research. And some recent theoretical work is actually trying to find mechanisms for strong emergence, for true novelty, right at the quantum to classical transition.
This brings us to that really cutting-edge stuff from 2025 in our sources. Let's look at Gerge's theory of emergent motion, or TOEM.
Right. So we usually assume that the classical motion we see every day, a ball rolling, is just an inherited property from quantum mechanics. TOEM challenges that.
How so?
It proposes that directional motion actually emerges as a probabilistic resolution only after a tiny discrete time threshold, what they call $t$. Before that threshold, there's quantum uncertainty. After it, a deterministic trajectory snaps into place.
So motion isn't a constant, it's a phase change. It freezes into reality.
Like water freezing into ice, yes. It's an attempt to put a rigorous mathematical framework around an emergent event, suggesting motion itself is a fundamentally emergent property.
And what about the emergence of space-time itself? That's Prakash's vibrational dynamics framework.
That one's even more mind-bending. It suggests that gravity space-time curvature emerges from complex, standing wave patterns in vibrational fields.
So the grand structure of the universe emerges from tiny quantum jitters stabilizing into a fixed pattern.
Exactly. The novelty there is defining the mechanism by which random quantum noise can stabilize into the fixed geometry of classical gravity. And later work even suggests that entropic mechanisms, disorder, and friction might actually drive that process, pushing the system past that $T threshold.
So noise and complexity aren't just a problem to be solved, they might be a constructive, necessary force.
That's the idea.
That gives us a remarkable perspective on the inorganic world. But what happens when we go even further up the complexity ladder and introduce, well, us, consciousness, free will, human interaction?
Right, moving from inanimate matter to sociology. Now, the components, human beings, are already immensely complex, yet their interactions create massive structures that none of them individually intended.
This is the idea of spontaneous order in society. Our sources point to Max Weber's classic, the Protestant ethic, and the spirit of capitalism.
A perfect early example. Weber argued that the system of capitalism emerged, in part, from the collective actions and beliefs of individuals who were just focused on their own salvation. They weren't setting out to invent the global economy.
It just emerged from their interactions.
It did. And you see this aggressively in emergent economics. Under capitalism, growth and innovation are emergent. The system becomes a self-expanding spiral.
And that's driven by a positive feedback loop, isn't it?
Yes. New tech increases productivity, which leads to more capital, which funds more research, which leads to new tech. The engine of modern economics is an emergent phenomenon fueled by its own output.
Karl Polanyi wrote about how this emergent process completely transformed society when things like labor and nature were turned into commodities.
That shift set the stage for our entire industrial society. It wasn't planned. It emerged from the interaction of these new market rules.
And this brings us to the really fascinating area of how we can tend to emergence in human systems. Peter Senge's work comes to mind.
Senge argues that living systems, families, organizations, economies, are continuously creating themselves. And if we try to manage them with a machine-age mindset of control and predictability, we'll just keep recreating the same old institutions.
Which leads right to the work of Nora Bateson and the International Bateson Institute. They don't try to predict what will emerge. They ask a different question.
A much better question. What makes a living system ready to change?
They call their approach readying. Instead of a 5-year plan with a fixed goal, you focus on tending the prelude to change. You nourish the system's flexibility, even if you don't know what crisis that flexibility will be needed for.
And their practical method for this is the Warm Data Lab. They bring together people from completely different backgrounds, a city planner, a biologist, a farmer, to talk about the same complex issue from their own unique contexts.
The goal isn't to find consensus, but to allow for something new to unfold. They call it aphenopoetic phenomena. That's a mouthful. What does it mean?
It literally means unseen creation. It's the inherent flexibility or capacity for a novel response that is unseen and unknown within the system. It's the potential for the system to adapt in a way no single expert could have predicted.
Okay, can you give me a practical example of that?
Imagine a city facing crises in housing, water, and transit all at once. A traditional approach tackles each one separately. A Warm Data Lab gets everyone talking about all three together.
And what might emerge?
The group might realize that a decentralized, community-managed water recycling system, which solves the water problem, could also double as a neighborhood meeting place, solving social isolation and reducing transit dependence.
So a single novel solution to 3 problems that wasn't on anyone's radar.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the aphenopoetic potential. You don't plan it, you cultivate the conditions for it to emerge.
It's a profound shift. And we even see this in something as basic as how we communicate every day. Linguistics has the concept of emergent grammar.
The perfect example of spontaneous order. Grammar isn't a set of top-down rules. It emerges from millions of speakers just trying to solve communication problems efficiently.
So no one decided we should all start using latus as a discourse marker. It just happened.
It just happened. If enough speakers find a strategy works, it spreads and eventually stabilizes into a new grammatical convention. The rules of language emerge purely from the microactions of its users.
So we've seen emergence in physics, in society. Now let's bring it right down to daily life and address one more philosophical twist: the role of the observer.
Yes. James P. Crutchfield made the point that complexity and organization are sometimes subjective qualities determined by the observer. Emergence isn't always an objective fact about the world. Sometimes it's about our perspective.
How does that work?
Think about a perfect diamond. An observer sees a beautiful, ordered, low-entropy structure. We call that order an emergent quality.
But we only see that order because we're deliberately ignoring the chaos underneath. The vibrating molecules, the quantum foam, we're sort of squinting.
That's a perfect way to put it. The order is, in that sense, subjective emergence. We've chosen a simpler macroscopic model that ignores the microscopic noise because it's computationally easier for our brains.
And the same goes for something we call chaotic, like the weather. We call it that because we can't process the position of every single air molecule, even though we assume it follows deterministic laws.
Exactly. So what we define as emergent can be a reflection of our own computational limits.
Let's make that even more tangible. What about emergent artifacts, human inventions?
Artifacts are created for a purpose, which makes their emergence subjective. Take a hammer.
A metal head and a wooden handle.
Individually, they have properties, but connect them in a clever way and you get the new emergent functionality of driving nails. And that function allows for downward causation.
Meaning the purpose loops back and changes the components?
Exactly. The desire to drive nails more efficiently leads us to optimize the head's weight or the handle's grip. The emergent property driving nails causes improvements in the underlying parts.
You see the same thing with bronze, right? A mix of tin and copper.
Which has new emergent properties.
Yeah.
It's harder and, crucially, has a lower melting point than either metal alone. That allowed early metallurgists to cast complex shapes. The desire for that emergent property drove the entire process.
We even see emergence in our technology, like with internet traffic.
Oh, absolutely. Congestion is an emergent property of the network, and sometimes that congestion can cause all the TCP flows to globally synchronize. They all slow down and speed up together like a giant coordinated pulse.
A behavior no single part was programmed to do.
And we even simulate emergence in AI. The boys program simulates a flock of birds. Each boy just follows 3 simple rules, but the collective flocking behavior is incredibly realistic.
And in all of these cases, artifacts, living things, the concept of supervenience is key.
Right. The emergent whole always supervenes on its crucial components: a construction error, a software bug, a genetic mutation. The emergent result is always tied to and dependent on its physical base.
Which reminds us that the line between just complex and truly new is a moving target, depending on the system and on the observer.
We have covered a huge amount of ground today. We started with that philosophical challenge from G.H. Lewis. How do you distinguish something truly new from something that's just a sum of its parts?
And we wrestled with Jaegwon Kim's logical crisis for strong emergence, the problem of causal overdetermination. If the physics is already doing all the work, what's the emergent property for?
And yet we saw how science, following Philip Anderson, has to accept the practical limits of reductionism. At great scales, new laws are required, and some things might even be fundamentally non-computable.
We then charted emergence as a driver of human systems, from the spiral of capitalism to the spontaneous order of language, and that incredible work being done to simply ready our systems for an unpredictable future.
The lesson is clear. Reductionism has its limits. The universe is a hierarchy, with novelty constantly bubbling up. There will always be levels of reality that require new laws and new insights.
The world is, in a very real way, continuously creating itself.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you. If we accept that weak emergence means a system is still, at bottom, just a giant calculation, but strong emergence implies true, irreducible novelty that changes the rules.
Then where do you draw the line? Think about the human mind. Is consciousness just a tremendously complicated traffic jam of neurons, a weakly emergent property of a complex but ultimately reducible machine?
Or is the mind a true categorical novum, a property that transcends the physical laws of the brain and possesses its own novel causal powers? We challenge you to apply these ideas to your own life and work. What do you believe is merely complex, and what do you believe is truly emergent?
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the unpredictable logic of emergence.
We'll catch you next time. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we've got, a truly monumental stack of sources, articles, research papers, data, and we're going to try and distill it all down.
And the topic is, well, it's colossal, literally.
Exactly. We're talking about megafauna, their secret lives, their deaths, and their absolutely essential role on the planet.
Right. And this is so much more than just, a fun trip to look at woolly mammoths.
Right.
The loss of these enormous animals, especially during the late ice age, it fundamentally reshaped entire ecosystems. I mean, globally.
We're talking about impacts that just ripple across continents, right?
Oh, absolutely. Influencing everything from, say, global climate stability all the way down to the nutrient composition of the soil in the Amazon basin. We are focusing on a very specific size-biased extinction event.
And that pattern is, what, unprecedented?
Completely unprecedented in the entire geological record.
Okay, let's unpack that right away, because the term megafauna, it gets thrown around a lot. We all sort of know it means big animals.
Yeah, from the Greek megas, large, and fauna for animal life. Simple enough.
But where do we actually draw the line? I mean, what is mega?
And that's the first problem, right? The definition is, well, it's unstable. It really varies depending on the environment, the time period, what a scientist is actually studying.
Okay, but there must be some kind of general rule of thumb.
There is. The most commonly adopted threshold you'll see in these big global studies is right around 45 kilograms.
45 kilograms, so about 99 pounds.
Yep.
I have to admit, that's smaller than I expected. That's like a teenager or a big dog. Why center the definition right there?
It's intentionally centered around the size of humans.
Yeah.
It just provides a convenient ecological marker. We're sort of the midpoint.
Yeah.
But you have to remember that 45 kilogram marker is really the absolute lowest end of a huge spectrum.
So it's a sliding scale.
A very wide one. If you look at, say, a very specific ecosystem, that lower threshold can be as little as 10 kilograms, 22 pounds, or it could go all the way up to 1,000 kilograms.
So if you're studying a remote island, the biggest animal there, maybe a 30-kilo reptile, that would count as the megafauna for that system.
Exactly. It's all about relative scale. It's context dependent.
But when we talk about the ones everyone pictures, the elephants, the giraffes, we're talking about the undisputed giants.
Precisely. The extant terrestrial megafauna. Elephants, rhinos, hippos, the bigger bovines like water buffalo. The animals that still define their habitats today.
And it's their sheer physical presence, right?
Yeah.
It's not just that they're heavy, it's the colossal impact they have just by existing.
That's the ecological hook. They aren't just living in the landscape. They are the architects of the landscape. They are engineers.
So.
Well, think about what they're doing all day. Foraging, trampling. They actively suppress the growth of woody vegetation.
So they're keeping forests from becoming too dense, turning them into savanna.
Right. And that has a critical ripple effect. You get less woody fuel built up, which means you get fewer, less intense wildfires. They also regulate the populations of smaller animals just through their presence and their movement.
Which brings us right to the central mystery here, the late Pleistocene extinction. If these giants are so important for stability, what happens when they just vanish?
It was a catastrophic shock to the system, and like we said, uniquely size-biased. Starting around 50,000 years ago, the world saw this mass extinction event.
And the statistic is just mind-boggling.
It is. Roughly 80% of all mammal species greater than 1,000 kilograms, that's 2,200 pounds, went extinct.
80%. The absolute biggest things on the planet were systematically wiped out.
While the small animals were largely untouched.
And that's what makes it so weird, so unprecedented. Previous mass extinctions, like the one that got the dinosaurs, they were widespread. They hit everything.
Exactly. The KPG event hit plants, marine life, small mammals. This was different. It was almost surgical, laser focused on the big stuff.
So what caused it? This is the big question.
That is the half-century-long debate. It really boils down to the interplay between two massive global forces at the time, the spread of us, Homo sapiens, and really intense, rapid climate change.
It's not one or the other.
Most scientists agree it's probably both. They aren't mutually exclusive. But the community is still fiercely divided on which was more important. Was it human hunting, the overkill hypothesis, or was it the pressure from a volatile environment?
Okay, so before we dive into that controversy, let's just nail down how scientists today talk about these animals, moving past just, how much they weigh.
Right. We have to talk about what they do. Back in 1876, Alfred Russel Wallace called them the hugest and fiercest and strangest forms.
Which is poetic, but maybe not super useful for conservation science.
Exactly. So in 2020, there was this big push, a study that looked at hundreds of papers to try and standardize the language.
And what did they come up with?
They proposed two really useful classifications, keystone megafauna and functional megafauna.
Keystone megafauna. That feels intuitive. A keystone species is one whose removal causes the whole system to collapse.
And adding mega just amplifies that. Their activity meets a disproportionate amount of needs for the rest of the ecosystem. Because they're so huge, their movements and, their digestion cycles affect vast areas.
So their loss could literally unravel an entire ecosystem.
It could. An elephant digging a water hole that saves dozens of other species in a drought. That's a keystone megafauna. Their sheer size just multiplies the consequence of everything they do.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. So what's the other category? Functional megafauna.
This one is a bit more nuanced. It refers to a species that is simply the largest in its particular taxonomic group, and it has clear advantages because of that size.
And this is where that sliding scale of what mega means comes back in.
Exactly. For a mega herbivore to be functionally mega, you probably need to be around 1,000 kilograms. That's the threshold to really be safe from most predators. But for a carnivore,
It's much smaller.
way smaller.
Yeah.
A terrestrial carnivore like a leopard or a wolf only needs to be around 13 to 16 kilograms to be considered functionally megafauna in its group.
Why such a huge difference?
Because at 16 kilograms, a predator already has a massive advantage. It can take down prey much larger than itself. It dominates smaller competitors. Its whole life strategy changes compared to, say, a small fox. Size is all relative to the job you're doing in the ecosystem.
That's a really brilliant distinction. It grounds the term in what the animal actually does.
And within that, there's a subterm, apex megafauna. And apex here doesn't just mean predator.
Right, it can apply to herbivores too.
A fully grown rhinoceros is an apex animal. Nothing hunts it for population control. Its range is dictated by food and water, not by running away from lions. Its size liberates it.
And that liberation, that life strategy is what defines them. It's the whole case strategy profile.
Textbook case strategists. High longevity, they live for decades. Very slow population growth, one baby at a time, long gestation periods, and as a result, very low adult mortality rates.
But that strategy, the thing that makes them so robust in a natural system,
Is there a fatal flaw when humans show up?
because they can't reproduce fast enough to replace the ones being hunted.
Exactly. Their slow recovery rates mean that even what seems like a sustainable level of hunting can wipe them out. You can erase decades of genetic history in just a few years. That's the ghost in the room for all modern conservation.
So we understand what they are, how they function.
Hmm.
Let's go back in time. Why did evolution even favor this supersizing in the first place?
Well, the path to being a giant is not quick or easy. There are serious constraints. One of the biggest is just the rate of size increase. You can grow fast for a little while, evolutionarily speaking, but you can't sustain that over deep time.
There's like a built-in speed limit.
There is. Studies have found the maximum rate scales with the time interval raised to the 0.25 power.
Okay, what does that actually mean in practice?
It means that if it takes you 1,000,000 years to double your body mass, it would take you 8,000,000 years to double it again. It gets harder and harder. Because every time you get bigger, you hit a new wall. Maybe your bones aren't strong enough. Maybe your heart can't pump blood that high. Your gut can't process enough food. To overcome each of those hurdles requires a whole new, time-consuming evolutionary innovation.
And what about getting smaller? Like insular dwarfism on islands.
That's the amazing contrast. The rate of getting smaller is over 30 times faster than the maximum rate of getting bigger. It is way, way easier for evolution to shed mass than it is to build it.
So after the dinosaurs were wiped out 66 million years ago, all these ecological niches opened up, and mammals just exploded in size.
They did. It was an almost exponential increase. We went from mammals that were just a few kilos to creatures around 750 kilos by the end of the Paleocene. That's just 10 billion years.
But to get to the truly colossal ones, the 10,000 kilogram mega herbivores, they needed a special trick.
They absolutely did. Think of the biggest of all time. The intercotheres, the proboscids like mammoths and elephants, they all share one crucial characteristic.
They're hindgut fermenters.
Exactly. Unlike foregut fermenters, like cows who have this really efficient but very slow multi-chambered stomach.
Hindgut fermenters do their digestion later in the tract.
Right, in the large intestine.
Yeah.
This lets them process huge volumes of low-quality food really, really fast.
So it's a volume game, not an efficiency game.
Precisely. They trade maximum nutrient extraction for just sheer intake. They can eat constantly and just push that bulk through quickly enough to maintain a 10,000 kilogram body.
Which is why we don't see 10,000 kilogram cows walking around.
But we do see multi-ton elephants. Now, for carnivores, it's a totally different story. They seem to hit a much harder ceiling.
Right around 1,000 kilograms.
We see it over and over with extinct predators like the short-faced bear, Arctodus.
So why do they max out at a ton when herbivores can go 10 times bigger?
A couple of reasons. One is just the pure energy cost of hunting. It gets exponentially harder. But the more fascinating idea is a biomechanical limit.
The humerus, the upper arm bone.
The stress on the humerus at top running speed. When a huge predator is running, pouncing, turning sharply, the twisting forces on those bones are immense.
And if they get too big?
The risk of a catastrophic fracture, of just snapping your leg, becomes so high that the advantage of being bigger is canceled out. It's a trade-off between speed and structural integrity.
A physiological wall. Okay, so if land mammals had all these constraints, what about marine mammals, the true supergiants?
Totally different set of rules. The biggest constraint of all gravity is basically removed by the water.
You don't need massive leg bones to hold yourselves up.
Exactly, and the results are just stunning. The blue whale, at over 150 metric tons, is the largest animal of all time. Period.
And their evolution was incredibly fast. From these little dog-sized creatures, the pachycetids, 53 million years ago.
To modern giants. And their rate of size increase was way faster than any terrestrial group.
Why was being so big so advantageous in the water?
Well, for the baleen whales, the filter feeders, it's about efficiency. As the climate cooled, you got these dense patches of plankton. A bigger mouth means you can scoop up exponentially more calories in one single lunge.
They're giant, efficient vacuum cleaners.
That's a good way to put it. And for the toothed whales, like the sperm whale, size meant they could dive deeper.
To get to the giant squid.
To get to the giant squid in a deep, less competitive environment. So either way, size paid off big time in the ocean.
And it wasn't just whales. There was the southern elephant seal, the largest carnivore ever, and the stellar sea cow.
A tragic story. 10,000 kilograms. Hunted to extinction in just 27 years after it was discovered by Europeans.
It just shows that even in the ocean, human impact can be swift and absolute.
Which brings us right back to those extinction pulses. The pattern in the late Pleistocene, it wasn't random at all. It followed humans around the globe.
This is the heart of the overkill hypothesis.
Outside of Africa and Asia, where Megafauna co-evolved with us for millions of years, the extinctions line up almost perfectly with human arrival.
So in Africa, the animals had time to adapt to human hunters.
Exactly. But when modern humans showed up on a new continent where the animals had no experience with our technology, the die-off was almost immediate.
Walk us through that timeline.
It's striking. Australia and New Guinea get hit first, around 46,000 years ago. Then the wave moves to North America, about 13,000 years ago. Then South America.
And then the islands, much later.
Madagascar, 2,000 years ago. New Zealand, with its giant moa birds, they were gone within a century or two of Polynesian arrival, just 700 years ago.
The correlation is it's incredibly compelling. And what's the counter-argument? The climate change side of the debate.
The climate first proponents argue that, yes, humans were there, but the real driver was environmental instability, intense droughts, rapid temperature shifts.
So their argument is that the megafauna were already stressed, their populations were fragmented, and humans just delivered the final blow.
That's the core of it. And they'll point to a lack of, widespread kill sites in some of the earliest regions like Australia.
It's a question of the ultimate cause.
Yeah.
But there's new forensic evidence that seems to be tipping the scales.
Yes. High-resolution chronologies from things like fungal spores.
Right, the Spormiella spores. What are they exactly?
They're a type of fungus that grows specifically on the dung of large herbivores.
So they're a proxy for how many big animals are around.
An exquisitely sensitive one. You take a sediment core from a lake, and the density of those spores, layer by layer, tells you exactly when the megafauna were there and exactly when they vanished.
That was brilliant. You don't need to find bones.
Yeah.
So what did the Australian cores show?
They showed that the Spormiella spores, and thus the megafauna, disappeared around 41,000 years ago. And critically, at that specific time, the climate was relatively stable.
So the animals disappeared first.
They disappeared first, and then immediately after, you see two things in the core. A huge spike in charcoal, indicating widespread fires.
And a shift in the vegetation.
From rainforests to more fire-tolerant plants. This strongly suggests that humans removed the mega-herbivores first, either by hunting or burning the landscape. Then, with no giant browsers to eat the fuel, the whole place went up in smoke.
The collapse of the fauna came before the environmental shift.
Exactly. If climate was the main driver, you'd expect to see it the other way around.
So this wasn't just a loss of species. This was a fundamental rewiring of Earth's operating systems. We have to talk about the so what, the actual consequence.
When they are staggering, they last for millennia. Let's start with nutrient transport.
Megafauna as biological pumps.
Precisely. In the Amazon basin, they would eat in mineral-rich floodplains near the Andes, and then, well, they'd walk into the nutrient-poor interior and poop it out.
Spreading fertilizer across the whole basin.
And when they disappeared, that lateral diffusion of nutrients was reduced by over 98%.
98%.
And this is for phosphorus, which is the key limiting nutrient for plant growth in most of the Amazon.
You're essentially starving the rainforest of a vital nutrient for the next 10,000 years.
We might still be seeing the effects of that starvation today in the growth patterns of the jungle.
That's a legacy effect.
Yeah.
But the most shocking one connects their death directly to global climate: methane.
This is where you see them acting as, planetary scale engineers. Mega herbivores produce a lot of methane, a potent greenhouse gas.
We can see this effect going way back, right, to the dinosaurs.
We can. The giant sauropods are estimated to have emitted 520 million tons of methane a year.
Wow.
It's thought that their biological emissions helped keep the planet up to 10 degrees Celsius warmer than it is today. They were methane factories.
So bring that forward to the Ice Age. If their presence warms the climate, what does their sudden absence do?
It cools it. The extinction of megafauna in the Americas caused an abrupt drop in methane production, estimated at about 9.6 million tons per year.
And this happens right at the start of the Younger Dryas.
The Younger Dryas, that bizarre rapid return to near glacial conditions right when the world was supposed to be warming up.
So you're saying the megafauna extinction could have helped trigger a global cooling event?
The hypothesis is that it contributed significantly. The ice cores showed that the drop in methane back then was 2 to 4 times more rapid than any other drop in the last 500,000 years. Something big and unusual had to have happened.
The near instantaneous removal of a huge biological methane source.
It fits the data. It connects human colonization, animal extinction, and a global climate shift into one, frankly, terrifying package.
So the lesson from all this is that these giants weren't just background decoration. They were critical regulatory mechanisms for the entire planet.
That's the core synthesis. The megabiota are disproportionately important for how the biosphere functions. Their decline has these profound downward effects on everything.
Which brings us to today. How does knowing all this help us protect what's left?
Well, it's shifting the focus to restoring function, the idea of rewilding.
Reintroducing species or analogs to do the jobs that were lost.
Exactly. Look at Madagascar. They lost their giant tortoises 2,000 years ago. A recent study introduced a similar tortoise species to fill that niche.
And what happened?
It prevented further extinctions among plants and animals that depended on the tortoise's role as a seed disperser. It shows that you can, sometimes, substitute a piece of the machinery to stabilize the system.
But let's circle back to the biggest, most immediate threat today.
Yeah, despite all the talk about climate and habitat loss, which are huge long-term problems, the sources are crystal clear.
Direct killing by humans.
For meat, for ivory, for body parts, it remains the single most significant factor in their decline today. It is the overwhelming driver.
So we have these slow reproducing case strategists facing their ultimate threat.
Us.
Right. If we could just stop the direct, unsustainable killing, we buy these precious planet-regulating animals the time they desperately need to have a fighting chance against the slower threats of habitat loss and climate change. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? If losing these ancient giants caused these devastating cascading effects, from starving the Amazon of nutrients to helping trigger a global climate shift, what's our responsibility to the ones that are left?
That really is the ultimate question, isn't it? The Earth's largest organisms, they're not optional extras. They're essential systems managers. Failing to protect them now isn't just a moral failure. It's a failure to learn the lessons that are written right there in the geological record.
Absolutely. Thank you for guiding us through this colossal and critical topic on the Deep Dive. Until next time.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking at one of those stories you think you know. The Wright brothers.
Right. Orville and Wilbur Wright. The first flight at Kitty Hawk. It's almost a piece of American folklore.
Exactly. We all see that famous black and white photo in our heads, the plane just lifting off the rail. But the real story, the thing that's so much more fascinating, isn't just that one 12-second hop.
No, not at all. It's the intellectual journey, the how. How did two brothers who didn't even have high school diplomas, running a small bicycle shop in Ohio,
Right.
how did they solve the problem of flight when you had these hugely funded, government-backed projects failing spectacularly?
That's the mission for this deep dive. We're going to cut through the myth and really focus on the mechanics and the scientific rigor that made it all possible, because they basically invented the language of aviation that we still use today.
And we can really just state the core finding right up front. Their entire mindset was different. Everyone else was thinking about power, bigger engines.
Just brute force it into the air.
Yeah, exactly. The Wrights realized that flight wasn't about power. It was about dynamic, continuous control.
That's the word, control.
They weren't trying to just shove a glider into the sky. They were obsessed with creating a system that would let a pilot constantly manage the plane's equilibrium in 3 dimensions.
And that's so critical. You can even see it in their first big patent. When they finally got it in 1906, it wasn't a patent for a flying machine.
No.
It was a patent for a system of aerodynamic control. They knew they had to manage the air, not just, ride on it.
So to understand that, you have to go back to Dayton, Ohio, late 1800s.
Yeah.
Wilbur and Orville, born in 1867 and 1871. Their father, Milton Wright, was a clergyman, so they were often called the Bishop's Boys.
And their education, or I guess the lack of a formal one, it's so interesting. Neither of them ever got a high school diploma.
Right. Wilbur finished the 4 years, but never bothered to get the actual diploma. He was brilliant, planning to go to Yale, but then he had this terrible accident.
A hockey accident, of all things.
Yeah, a hockey stick to the face. It left him with some health complications, but also, it seems, it sent him into a period of withdrawal. He just stayed home for years and read everything in his father's library.
And Orville was the more outgoing, mechanically minded one. He dropped out of high school to start his own printing business.
And they didn't just run a printing business, they designed and built their own printing presses. So from a young age, they had this deep, hands-on understanding of complex mechanics.
But the bicycle shop, that seems to be where it all comes together. The Wright Cycle Exchange opened in 1892.
Yes. That shop gave them 2 things. First, the money to fund their experiments. But second, and this is far more important, it gave them a philosophical framework.
The bicycle as an unstable vehicle.
Exactly. A bicycle doesn't balance itself. You, the rider, have to make constant, tiny, active adjustments to stay upright. You are in active control.
Whereas their competition, people like Samuel Langley with his huge government grants.
They were thinking about ships or trains. They wanted inherent stability. They wanted to build a machine that would just automatically fly straight and level, like a boat rights itself in the water.
And that's a fundamentally flawed way to think about flying. If you have perfect stability, you can't maneuver. You sacrifice control.
The Wrights knew that from riding bikes. They believed a flying machine should be unstable, and that the pilot's job was to master it through practice and skill. They wanted absolute control.
So what was the initial spark? I know there was a toy they had as kids.
Yeah, their father brought home a little toy helicopter in 1878. But the real turning point, when it became a serious obsession, was 1896.
A huge year for aviation.
It was. First, they read about Langley's successful unmanned model flights. And then they saw these incredible reports about the German pioneer Otto Lilienthal and his dramatic glides.
But then almost immediately after, they hear that Lilienthal crashed and died.
And that, they said, was the real beginning of their serious work. It proved 2 things at once. Gliding practice was the right path, but Lilienthal's method of control, just shifting his body weight around, was totally inadequate. It was a dead end, literally.
So they needed a mechanical system.
Right. And Wilbur got the idea from watching birds. He noticed they don't shift their weight to turn, they change the angle of the tips of their wings. They bank into a turn, just like a cyclist does.
And this leads to the famous aha moment in the bike shop with the inner tube box.
That's the one. He's just idly twisting a long, flat cardboard box and realizes he can twist the 2 ends in opposite directions.
And that's the mechanical equivalent of what the bird's wings were doing.
Precisely. One wingtip gets more lift, the other gets less, and the whole thing rolls. They called it wing warping. It was the first piece of the puzzle. A mechanical solution for lateral or roll control. They tested it on a little 5-foot kite in 1899, and it worked.
So right from the start, they're on a completely different path from everyone else who's just thinking about rudders, like on a boat.
Completely different. They understood that to turn in the air, you had to roll.
Hmm.
So by 1900, they were ready to build a full-scale glider. They needed a place with good wind and soft sand for the inevitable crashes.
And they end up at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina.
Yeah, on the advice of another aviation enthusiast, Octave Chanute. But they also picked it because it was remote. They wanted privacy from reporters.
And their early gliders, they weren't reinventing everything from scratch, were they? They were building on what others had done.
No, they were smart about it. They used the biplane design Chanute recommended, and they used cambered or curved wings, which is a known principle for generating lift.
But they did add one really important safety feature.
The canard design. They put the elevator, the surface, for controlling pitch, for going up and down out front. The idea was that if the glider stalled, the nose would drop first, preventing that catastrophic nosedive that killed Lilienthal.
So they're thinking about control and safety from day one. But the 1901 glider, it didn't go well.
It was a complete disaster. Two massive problems. First, it only produced about a third of the lift their calculations said it should. It just wouldn't fly right.
And the second problem was even worse.
Much worse. When Wilbur tried to use the wing warping to turn, the glider would sometimes spiral into the ground. It was suffering from something they called, well, something we now call adverse yaw.
Okay, let's break that down because it's so important.
Right. So when you warp the wings to roll, say to the right, you increase the lift on the left wing. But increasing lift also increases drag. So that left wing, the one that's lifting up, is also being dragged backward.
Ah, so it pulls the nose of the plane away from the turn.
Exactly. You want to turn right, but for a split second, the nose yaws to the left. It's incredibly dangerous if you can't control it.
And Wilbur was just crushed by this failure.
He was. This is when he made that famous comment to Orville that man wouldn't fly in 1,000 years. But here's the crucial part. Instead of giving up, they became scientists. They realized the problem wasn't them, it was the data. All the published aeronautical data was wrong.
They started with that lift problem and a number called the Smeaton coefficient.
Yeah, a value for air pressure that engineers have been using for over 100 years. The standard value was 0.00054. Wilbur went over all their flight data and proved that the real number was much lower, closer to 0.0033.
So the very foundation of their calculations was flawed by almost 50%.
Completely flawed. But just correcting the number wasn't enough. They realized Lilienthal's tables for lift on different wing shapes were also wrong, or at least they didn't apply to their designs. They had to generate their own data.
And they built that incredible little device with the bicycle wheel to prove it.
A brilliant, simple experiment. It proved the official tables were wrong, so they decided they needed their own laboratory.
Back in the bike shop, in the fall of 1901, they built a 6-foot-long wooden box, a wind tunnel.
This was the game changer. It wasn't the first wind tunnel, but it was the first one designed to systematically and accurately measure lift and drag on hundreds of different miniature wing shapes.
And the little balances they built inside to measure the forces, they were made from bicycle spokes and scrap metal.
Just incredible ingenuity. And in about 2 months, they tested around 200 different wing designs. Historians call it the most crucial and fruitful aeronautical experiments ever conducted.
And they made a key discovery about the shape of the wings.
A huge discovery. They found that long, narrow wings, what we call a high aspect ratio, were far more efficient. They had a much better lift-to-drag ratio than the short, stubby wings they'd been using.
So armed with this brand new, super accurate data, they built the 1902 glider.
And it was a spectacular success. They made hundreds of glides going over 600 feet, but there was still that one problem.
Adverse yaw, the well digging.
It was still there. Their 1902 glider had a fixed vertical rudder at the back, but it wasn't solving the problem. And then Orville has the final breakthrough.
What was it?
He realized the fixed rudder was actually making things worse. It was fighting the turn. He figured out that the rudder needed to be movable, and this is the genius part, it needed to be linked to the wing warping mechanism.
So that when you warp the wings to roll, the rudder automatically moves to counteract the adverse yaw.
Precisely. And they realized the rudder's main job wasn't to steer the plane like a boat. Its job was to keep the nose pointed correctly through the turn that was being initiated by the wings.
Roll, pitch, and yaw.
The 3-axis control system. They had solved it. That 1902 glider is, for all intents and purposes, the invention of the airplane. The motor was just an add-on after that.
And they filed their patent based on that glider before they had even flown with an engine.
Exactly. The patent was for the control system because they knew that was the real secret.
Okay, so control is solved. Now they just need to add power.
Just.
Yeah.
It turned out to be a huge challenge. They needed a lightweight engine, but when they wrote to car manufacturers, nobody could build one that was light enough.
So they did what they always did.
They built it themselves. Well, with their shop mechanic, the brilliant Charlie Taylor. He built them a 12-horsepower engine in about 6 weeks.
And it had an aluminum engine block, which was incredibly advanced and rare for the time.
It was. And you have to remember the cost. Their entire 1903 flying machine, engine included, cost them less than $1,000 of their own money.
Well, Samuel Langley had $50,000 in government funds, and his machine just plopped into the Potomac River.
Twice. A total failure. The contrast is just stunning.
And the propellers were another piece of original engineering.
Another one, yeah. There was no existing science for air propellers, so they had this incredible intellectual leap. They realized a propeller is basically just a wing that rotates vertically.
So they could use all that precious data from their wind tunnel tests to design it.
Exactly. They designed these incredibly efficient wooden propellers. Modern tests show they were about 82% efficient, which is, that's remarkably close to what we can achieve today.
So finally, we're at Kill Devil Hills, December 17th, 1903. Freezing cold, crazy strong headwind.
Orville wins the coin toss. And at 10:35 in the morning, he makes the first flight.
The first controlled, sustained flight of a heavier-than-air powered aircraft. 120 feet. 12 seconds.
They flew 4 times that day, with Wilbur taking the last and longest flight, 852 feet in 59 seconds.
And then after all that work, a gust of wind just picks up the machine and smashes it to pieces.
Yeah, it never flew again. And the public reaction was, well, nothing.
A total fizzle. The local paper wouldn't even run the story. They said the flights were too short to be important.
The world just completely missed it. But the Wrights knew they weren't done. A few short hops and a strong headwind didn't prove they had a practical machine.
So they moved their operations back home to a cow pasture in Ohio called Huffman Prairie.
Right. And over the next 2 years, 1904 and 1905, they refined the machine. They add a catapult for takeoff since the winds aren't as strong. And in 1904, Wilbur flies the first complete circle in history.
But the 1905 Flyer III, that was the real masterpiece.
It was. They rebuilt it after a bad crash and made a crucial change to the controls. They separated the rudder control from the wing warping.
So the pilot now had independent control of all 3 axes.
Yes, a hip cradle for roll, a stick for pitch, a handle for yaw. It gave the pilot so much more finesse and authority.
And the results were just undeniable.
Oh, absolutely. By the fall of 1905, Wilbur was flying for over half an hour at a time, covering 24 miles, doing laps around the pasture, until he literally ran out of gas. They had created the world's first practical airplane.
And then after achieving all that, they just stopped flying.
For almost 3 years. They were terrified someone would steal their design before they could sell it to the government. This secrecy, though, it backfired. The U.S. Army was skeptical. The press was skeptical.
The whole world was skeptical.
It fueled years of intense doubt.
And that doubt turned into outright hostility, especially in Europe. By 1906, they were being called bluffers. Bluffers.
Yeah, a Paris newspaper famously wrote something like, "The Wrights have flown or they have not flown. They are in fact either flyers or liars." That was the mood.
So they had to prove it. In 1908, they finally get contracts, but they have to do public demonstrations. Wilbur goes to France, Orville stays to demonstrate for the U.S. Army.
And Wilbur, in Le Mans, France, in August 1908, he just blows everyone's minds.
It wasn't just that he could fly, it was how he flew.
Over the banking turns, no one in Europe had seen that. They were still trying to do flat, skidding turns with rudders. When Wilbur did these graceful, coordinated, banked figure eights, the skepticism just evaporated overnight.
He became a global celebrity.
Instantly. Meanwhile, Orville is back in Virginia doing the same thing for the Army, breaking flight duration records.
But then tragedy strikes. September 17th, 1908.
A terrible day. He's flying with an Army observer, Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, and a propeller splits midair. The plane crashes.
And Lieutenant Selfridge becomes the first person to die in an airplane crash.
He does. And Orville is horrifically injured. Broken leg, broken ribs, hip fractures that would cause him pain for the rest of his life.
It's just an awful story. But his response, even from the hospital bed, was just so determined.
Defiant, really. He said the only thing he was afraid of was not getting well soon enough to finish the tests. This is also when their sister, Catherine, really steps into the public eye, managing everything while Orville recovered.
After he recovers, the three of them become these global icons, touring Europe, meeting royalty. They finally complete the army contract and start to see some financial success.
But that success leads directly into the next big, draining chapter of their lives, the patent wars.
It all centered around that 1906 patent for the control system.
Right. And their main legal opponent was another aviation pioneer, Glenn Curtiss. Curtiss was using ailerons' little hinged flaps on the wings for roll control instead of wing warping.
And he argued that ailerons were a totally separate invention.
But the Wright's patent was written very broadly. It covered any method of varying the angle of the wings to create a roll. And Wilbur, especially, saw this as a moral fight. He felt Curtiss was stealing the fundamental principle of their invention.
And the legal battle was just all-consuming.
It was. It drained their money, their time, and their creative energy. Wilbur said he felt sad when he thought about what they could have invented if they hadn't been stuck in courtrooms.
It's really a tragic turn. They were inventors, not litigators.
And they climaxed with Wilbur's death in 1912 from typhoid fever. He was only 45. And many people, including his family, believe the stress of the patent wars wore him down and made him unable to fight off the illness.
It's just devastating. The wars didn't even end until World War I, when the government basically forced all the companies into a patent pool to speed up production.
And in the ultimate irony, the Wright Company eventually merged with the Curtiss Company in 1929. They became Curtiss-Wright.
Wow.
After Wilbur's death, Orville just wasn't interested in running a company anymore. He sold it in 1915.
He became more of an elder statesman for aviation.
Exactly. He served on the board of NASA, the precursor to NASA, for 28 years. He was a guiding hand for American aviation for decades.
There's a really nice family story from before Wilbur died, though. In 1910, they finally flew together.
Yeah, their father had made them promise to never fly together, just in case, but they did it once. And right after that, Orville took his 82-year-old father, Milton, up for his first and only flight.
And his dad just yelled, "Higher, Orville, higher."
A great story. It shows you how much of a family project this really was.
But Orville's later life was also defined by this really intense feud with the Smithsonian Institution.
A battle over historical truth. The Smithsonian was desperate to prop up the reputation of its former secretary, Samuel Langley, whose aerodrome had failed so publicly.
So they put Langley's machine on display and claimed it was the first machine capable of manned flight.
And they based that claim on these shady tests done in 1914 by Glenn Curtiss, of all people. Curtiss had taken Langley's machine and secretly made dozens of major modifications to get it to fly for a few seconds.
Including adding his own control system.
Of course. And the Smithsonian just ignored all that. Orville was furious. He called it a perversion of history.
So he refused to give them the original 1903 flyer.
He did. As a protest, in 1928, he sent it to the Science Museum in London. He was making a stand.
And the feud lasted for decades.
It wasn't resolved until 1942, when the Smithsonian finally gave in, published a list of all of Curtiss's modifications, and officially recanted their claims. Only then did Orville agree to have the flyer brought home.
And there's a clause in the contract, isn't there?
A fascinating one. The Smithsonian bought the plane for $1 with the legal condition that they could never again claim that an earlier aircraft was capable of controlled flight.
So the legacy is secure, and it's a legacy that continues with the friendly rivalry between Ohio, the birthplace of aviation pioneers, and North Carolina, first in flight.
And it's even gone off-world. A piece of the original flyer's wing fabric went to the moon with Neil Armstrong on Apollo 11.
And another piece is on Mars, attached to the Ingenuity helicopter. NASA even named the Martian airfield Wright Brothers Field.
It's an incredible tribute. Orville lived until 1948, long enough to see the dawn of supersonic flight. He saw his invention go from a 12-second hop to breaking the sound barrier.
So when you, our listener, think about this, what's the big takeaway? For me, it's that they didn't just invent a machine. They invented the method, the mechanism of control.
That's it. They solved the problem of balance and stability with science, with their wind tunnel and their data, before they even thought about adding an engine. The three-axis control system is why their invention worked, and it's why every single plane flying today still uses their fundamental philosophy.
And we should leave you with one final, kind of a heavy thought from Orville himself. Late in his life, seeing the destruction caused by bombers in World War II, he said, "We dared to hope we had invented something that would bring lasting peace to the earth. But we were wrong."
It raises that timeless question, doesn't it, about the burden of invention. How do you reconcile your hope for what your creation can do with the unintended and sometimes terrible ways that the world ends up using it. That's a weight the Wrights carried long after they left the dunes of Kitty Hawk.